Welcome back, everyone. So, this week we're going to be focusing on pies. And so today I'm just going to go over the pie basics with you and just have you answer a quick question in Google Classroom. So, let's chat about pies. Okay, pies are pretty much they have their crust, and inside them they are typically a sweeter flavor, but there are savory pies out there. So it's a sweeter savory filling that's in a baked crust. With pies you can have just the bottom crust, or you can have a double crust, or you call that a full crust, and that just means that there's a crust on the bottom and the top, and oftentimes the crust on the top is decorated, and so you can see an example of that in the picture there. That would be an example of a lattice top. So the weaving of the strips up there. And pies are made in this guy in your typical pie pan. So it's a round pan. These sides are actually sloped, and you typically cut and serve pie in wedges. Now, we are going to have a lab, but I'm going to stretch it over the next 2 weeks, and it's going to be a pie lab. So if you do not have a pie pan, that is okay. You do not have to go out and buy one by any means, because we can get creative and even use a muffin tin, okay, and make little mini pies. So just want to let you know we are going to be making pie over the next 2 weeks. And so if you have a pie pan, great. If not, we can improvise with a muffin tin. So doughs for pie crust. The dough is, I personally think like the filling is great, but like if the dough is bad on a pie, I just think it ruins the whole thing. Okay. So a couple things affect the overall dough the overall dough, which then turns into the pie crust. So the type of fat that you use, that is going to change the flavor and flakiness, and we'll go through the different types of fats that can be used in pie crust. Um, how you incorporate the fat is we're going back to that biscuit mixing method, which we talked about that in quick breads, but that's when you use the pastry cutter to cut in the fat into your dry ingredients. And so, depending on how small you cut the fat source into, it kind of makes two different types of pie dough. So, you have flaky pie dough, and that is a larger cut of fat into the dry ingredients. And then you have mealy pie dough, which is cutting the fat into smaller, finer, uniform pieces. So you have that dough, which is typically just made from your fat source, flour, salt, and then typically just water, and that's about your pie dough. But you also have the crumb crust that is kind of the outlier. But think about if you've ever had cheesecake. Cheesecake typically comes in a crumb crust, and that's where you take crushed cookies or other crumbs and butter, and you just kind of blend that together and push it down on the pan. So it's typically used for cheesecakes or like custard pies too. So again, just some differences between the flaky and the mealy pie dough. So we'll start with flaky pie dough. So it gets its name for its final baked texture because your pie dough is going to be really flaky. This is really good for pie top crust and lattice crust, and it's really good for pre-baked shells. Okay, and so that's where you bake the pie shell without filling. We actually call that blind baking. Then you have your mealy pie dough. This is just more of a sturdy dough. So when you have like a very heavy filling, this is going to be good. Okay, so when a soggy crust would be a problem, it's just more sturdy compared to a flaky dough, and this is really good for a fruit or a custard pie. Again, because they have a lot of liquids, they could very easily seep through that pie dough, that pie crust, and you just don't want that because then it all falls apart. So some visual differences here. You can see the flaky dough. So the fat is a larger pieces, so like pea size, that's the one on the left, okay? And you can see compared to the sizes of the crumbles and the chunks, which is the fat on the right, that's your mealy dough, okay? So it looks a little bit more coarse, where the other one just looks a little bit more chunky. So again, it all just really depends on how much you cut in that fat source with the flour and the dry ingredients. So this is crumb crust. Again, that's where you take a crust and you grind up cookie crumbs. I usually do it with graham crackers. That's really popular. And you just moisten it with the melted butter. And typically you're using this with cheesecake or chiffon fillings. You can grind your crumbs up a couple different ways. Growing up, my mom would put the graham crackers in a Ziploc bag, and we would smash it and then roll it out with a rolling pin. But you can even pop it in a food processor, or honestly, like even like if you have a Ninja blender at home, that will work too. So it's pretty simple to do.
I love this. I never realized how easy or cheap it was to make a graham cracker crust, writes one All Recipes member about this great graham cracker crust recipe. Thanks to Carol, the member who submitted it. Begin this recipe by preheating the oven to 375 degrees. Add 1½ cups of finely ground graham cracker crumbs into a medium bowl. Add 1/3 cup of sugar, 6 tablespoons of melted butter, and 1/2 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. Stir the ingredients until well blended. Press the mixture evenly into the bottom and sides of an 8 or 9-inch pie plate. Bake it for 7 minutes.
So that's just the gist of a crumb crust. From here on out, we're really going to focus on though the mealy pie dough and the flaky dough. So that type of pie crust. So here is a pie dough recipe, and I'll throw it in classroom today. But let's just look at, this is the pie dough recipe that I use in class with you guys. It comes from my mother-in-law actually, but let's just look at those ingredients. So to get pie dough, it's literally flour, salt, shortening, and ice cold water. Okay, that ice cold is really important. Um, so 4 ingredients, very, very simple. Like I said, I am going to have you guys make pie dough during this week. So if you don't have flour at home, salt, shortening, or water, you just reach out to me. I'm assuming you probably have everything besides shortening. So you just reach out and I can get you shortening if that's a problem. So let's talk about pie dough ingredients. As a recap, flour. We know flour gives us structure, okay? If you incorporate too much flour into your pie crust, it's going to be very tough. If it's too little, gluten will not develop, but also, okay, your pie crust is just not going to have the right amount of structure and it's going to be crumbly and fall right apart, okay? Water. So water, again, it provides moisture by producing steam. We've heard that a couple times now. If we, as we talked about the importance of, not opening the oven when the puff or when the cream puffs were rising with the pâte dough. We heard about it last week. Okay, with the different layers with the puff pastry and the phyllo dough. And again, we're hearing about how important that is. Your water wants to be really, really cold to avoid melting the fat source that you have cut into your pie crust. Okay, so as you incorporate the water, it should be very cold. If you put too much water in there, okay, it's actually going to turn your pastry kind of tough, and it might be also runny and kind of hard to work with. Too little, your pastry is just going to be really crumbly. It's not going to come together in the nice pie dough ball that it should. Salt is just really in there for flavor. And then, whoops, and then we have our fat source, okay? And so your fat always gives tenderness, it gives texture to your pie crust, okay, and really to any baked good. It makes it very tender. With pie, we don't want to overdevelop the gluten, so we want to work with pie crust very, very little, okay? So I've said it before, but we want to cut in the fat source when we're making pie crust. So different fats that can be used for pies, okay? Shortening. Shortening is by far the most popular. You get a very flaky crust, doesn't have a little flavor. With pies, the crust I think is really important, but the flavor doesn't really come from the crust. That's really the filling, okay? Um, Shortening is most often used because shortening has a higher melting point, which means you can work with the dough a little bit longer without melting those chunks of fat into it and then losing the flakiness that comes from cutting in the fat source with your dry ingredients. So shortening better and used often because it has a higher melting point, which means you can work with it a little bit longer before melting, before having really that shortening melt in your dough and then lose those flaky layers. Butter is also used though because it gives a really good flavor. Okay, it's not quite as flaky of a crust, and you've got to work with it really fast. So because it has a low melting point, butter will start to melt, and then once that butter is melted into the dough, um, you lose your flakiness. Okay, so that's really the two that you see, and that's why in our recipe that I'm sharing with you guys, it uses shortening, and most of the pie recipes that I've worked with uses shortening for the crust. Um, and again, just to reiterate, butter, lower melting point. You can't work with the dough as long, okay, before being baked, so it can lose the flakiness of the crust. Some other ones that people use is lard. This is the flakiest crust, but the flavor is not very good. Okay, I do know people that use lard in their pie crust, so really flaky crust, but the flavor just is a little off, especially when you're making fruit pies. Oil. I've never seen anybody use this because you can't cut it in. The crust just doesn't have good structure. It won't have flakiness, so just that is one to avoid. So when we're making pie dough, okay, here's just some tips for handling the dough. Um, if you handle it too much, you cause that gluten to overdevelop, and you have a very tough pastry. Okay, so you want to make sure you're very gentle with it, and you're mixing it and you're rolling it out as little as possible. Okay, you don't want to overmix the dough when adding in your liquid. Um, you don't want to be too rough with your rolling pin, and you really shouldn't have to like stretch the pastry into the pie plate. Um, I will demonstrate pie dough tomorrow for you guys, and so you'll kind of see. Really, it's a very quick process, but it can be tricky because it's very easy to just want to keep working with it, and again, that causes your fat source to melt into the dough, and then you lose that flaky layers from the crust. So when you shape crust, so let's say we've made our pie dough. Now we want to shape it. So pretty much what you do is you just roll it out. So kind of just like you're rolling out a pizza. The dough's a little bit more delicate than that though. And you roll it out big enough so you can fit your pie pan on top of it, and then you kind of on the picture there you can see you kind of roll it up on the rolling pin, and then you roll it off on the on the pie pan, but I'll show you guys all of that tomorrow. Pie dough is much, much easier to work with when it's a cool temperature because it keeps that fat firm, and it also helps to prevent stickiness. But with any pastry, remember to work on a clean surface. You want to dust that with flour. If the dough becomes sticky, two things. It might just be getting too warm, so you might want to throw it in the fridge for a little bit, or you could try just adding some flour. As you're working with it and rolling it out, it should still feel cold to the touch. Um, so that's a bottom crust, and then later in the week we're going to get into a little bit more of in-depth pie things. So today's just kind of some pie basics for you, telling you what they are, about those different types of doughs, some tips to work with them, some of the basic ingredients. Tomorrow I'm going to really go through making pie dough and how you roll it out. Wednesday we're going to talk about the different fillings. Thursday we're going to talk about those fun pie designs on the tops and on the sides. And then Friday I'm going to have you guys actually go ahead and start making some pie dough. Okay, pie dough is okay sitting in the fridge for a couple of days or even freezing it. So we're just going to kind of go slow and break this down. So how do if you've done these things right? Well, your pie dough is tender. It's very flaky. Okay, you should kind of see those layers again. It's very lightly and even brown, and it's a pleasing flavor. Okay, you don't want like a tough pie crust, like almost one where like it's really hard to stab into as you're trying to eat the pie. So some pie terminology. Blind crust, we also call it baking blind, is when you bake a pie crust without filling. Okay, so your pie crust is all rolled out here in this picture, and you can see they're poking some holes in it here. Okay, and then they have covered it and they've put these are little baking beads in there. Okay, you can also use rice. That's what we use at school. And the whole purpose of this, okay, is because you want a baked pie crust, because whatever you're filling it with doesn't need to be baked, okay? So a lot of times this is like with custard pies, because you already make the filling on the stove top, and you let it cool, and then you put it in the pie. So you want your pie crust to be baked. So a couple of things that you're seeing in these pictures is you're seeing a fork prick the bottom of the hole. Okay, that allows the steam to escape as it is baking, as the pie crust is baking. And as that happens, sometimes steam and air like to get trapped under there, and it actually causes a bubble to rise. Okay. And so we don't want that, because if that bubble rises and it bakes like that, when we put that filling in, it's going to break that bubble, and then there's going to be filling all under the bottom of the pie. So we prick it with a fork to allow that steam to escape. But then we add the baking beans in there. Okay. So dry beans, baking beans, pastry beads, rice you can use. Okay, and it helps put weight on the pastry, so that way the crust does not blister or really cause those bubbles. Okay, so that's a term that is pretty common in the pie world. Another term is fluting, and that's the decorative edge that is given to pies. So you can see an example here, and you can see an example here. We'll talk more about fluting and the top crust, again, like I said, on Thursday. So that is just pie basics, lots of information. I'm doing this really early Monday morning, so sorry if it kind of rambled a little bit. So I just have 3 questions for you guys on Google Classroom. I'm just asking you about some of the stuff you learned in this presentation today. So some of those bigger concept things that I want you to really know about pies. And then I want to see, how do you guys feel about pie? Do you like pie? Do you not like pie? I love pie. I don't really like fruit pies. Pecan pie is my favorite, and I really like custard pies too. Like French silk pie is really good, or that would be more of a chiffon pie because it's a lighter texture. All right, well, that's what I have for you guys today. So I'll see you back here tomorrow, where I will be demonstrating actually making pie dough, and you can just see really how simple it is and how easy it is to put together.